Interested in staying informed, but without getting totally swamped by just a flood of data, well, you're in the right place. Welcome to the deep dive. Here, we dig into various sources and pull out the essentials for you.
Exactly. And today we're going to dive into several current topics. We're really aiming for that kind of, rigorous analysis and common sense interpretation you see from analysts like Jean Foutol. It's about looking beyond the headlines.
Right. Getting to the criteria, the interpretation, the actual substance, that's the goal.
Precisely. Foutol's approach, that focus on reflection, is key.
Wow.
We want to connect the dots for you.
Okay, so today we're focusing on some recent news involving political figures and also international trade, looking at it through different media lenses.
Yep. And for this dive, we've pulled from quite a mix: traditional news reports, analyses from YouTube channels like Jesus Cintura, All Amoroso clips, Visual Politic.
Diario Público, Solo Fonseca, the Mexican family too, a real range.
It gives us that diversity of voices, helps build a richer picture, hopefully. So the mission for you listening is to grasp the core points and see how these events, which might seem separate, are actually, well, quite linked.
Let's start then. First up, the situation involving Isabel Diaz Ayuso's partner, her boyfriend, Alberto Gonzalez Amador. He's had to testify before a judge, right?
That's right. Facing accusations of business corruption and disloyal administration.
And this happened while she was actually out of the country, wasn't she?
Yeah, in Ecuador.
Yeah.
Which, has drawn some comment. The timing.
Okay, so what's the core of the investigation?
It centers on a pretty significant payment, €500,000.
$500,000, wow.
Yeah, from Gonzalez Amador's company to, get this, a depilation company.
A hair removal company.
Owned by the wife of an executive at Chiron Prevention, a major health services group.
Okay, and the suspicion is?
The prosecution suspects this payment might have been a commission, basically a kickback.
A kickback for what?
Linked to getting a contract for masks during the pandemic. The whole Pilotazo de las Mascarillas, the mask windfall scheme, basically.
Ah, okay. So compensating the Chiron executive for helping secure that contract.
That seems to be the theory they're investigating. And there's another angle, too.
Which is?
Whether this whole setup was also designed to, let's say, reduce the tax burden for Ayuso's partner, to pay less tax than was due.
Right. Tax avoidance, potentially?
Potentially. And it doesn't stop there. They're also looking into possible false invoices connected to these deals.
False invoices, too. So multiple potential issues here.
Exactly. It's quite complex. There's even a separate investigation into alleged illegal commissions paid to a Chiron executive.
How were those supposedly paid?
Through the purchase of another company, one that investigators say was basically inactive.
Inactive? What did it own?
Well, according to reports, its assets were pretty minimal: an old computer and 2 used depilation machines.
An old computer and 2 waxing machines.
Okay. So when Gonzalez Amador testified before the judge, Cadena Ser reported he defended his business activities, said they were all above board.
And denied hiding anything from the tax authorities.
Denied it then, yes. But, and this is important, reports also state that earlier, through his lawyer, he had admitted to tax fraud in communications with the prosecutor's office. There was apparently even an email acknowledging the offenses.
So a direct contradiction there.
It certainly appears that way. One story for the prosecutor, another for the judge.
And while all this is unfolding in court, Ayuso is where?
Well, she was away. First a trip to Extremadura and then this trip to Ecuador when her partner was actually in court.
Right. And how was this covered back in Madrid? By Telemadrid, the public broadcaster.
Well, that caused some controversy.
Yeah.
Critics pointed out that Telemadrid dedicated very, very little time to the news of his court appearance.
Really? What did they show instead?
Focus more on unrelated human interest stories, apparently, right when the hearing was happening.
Which predictably led to fireworks in the Madrid assembly, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Accusations flew back and forth, insults traded over her absence, over the corruption allegations themselves. The opposition definitely highlighted her being away.
Okay, let's talk more about that trip to Ecuador. What was the stated purpose?
Officially, she was there promoting a well-known Madrid private university, the Instituto de Empresa.
Okay. Anything else?
Yes. She was also supporting the re-election campaign of the Ecuadorian president, Daniel Noboa.
Interesting. And Telemadrid was covering this trip.
Oh, yes. They were covering her activities in Ecuador.
Now, wasn't Ayuso quite critical of Pedro Sanchez, the prime minister, when he traveled to China?
She was, yeah. That's where the contrast comes in. She accused Sanchez of pursuing an anti-Western agenda, of isolating Spain, Pretty strong words.
But isn't there some context missing there? What about her own party's connections?
Well, yeah, commentators were quick to point out that Ayuso's own party, the Partido Popular, had previously signed an agreement with the Chinese Communist Party.
Right, and hadn't Ayuso herself met with the Chinese ambassador?
She had met with the Chinese ambassador in Spain. So those facts kind of undermine the criticism of Sanchez's trip, or at least make it look more like political maneuvering, perhaps.
And some suggested her Ecuador trip was maybe convenient.
Exactly. The suggestion was floated that the trip might have been a way to, divert media attention from her partner's legal troubles back home. Hard to say for sure, but the timing was noted.
Okay, let's shift gears significantly now to the international stage and Donald Trump's trade policies. Big news there recently.
Yes, quite a stir. Trump announced tariffs on goods from multiple countries. Initially, it seemed to include the EU and China, quite broadly.
But then there was a change.
Right. Fairly quickly, he announced a 90-day suspension for most countries involved, except China. Tariffs on Chinese goods were set for a significant increase.
And the markets, how did they react?
Well, initially, there was a dip. Uncertainty. But then they recovered somewhat after the suspension was announced. Still, underlying volatility remains a concern for many analysts.
There was also a pretty serious allegation floating around about Trump himself, wasn't there?
Yes, quite serious.
Yeah.
An allegation that he might have tipped off his followers, suggesting they buy stocks before the tariff announcement was made public.
Which, if true, would be problematic, to say the least. Insider information territory.
Highly problematic, ethically and potentially legally. It's an allegation that's out there.
Now, back in Spain, how did this play out politically? I saw some strong words from Rufián.
Gabriel Rufián, yes.
Yeah.
He was extremely critical of Vox's stance on Trump's tariffs.
What did he say?
He labeled them vendepatrias, which translates roughly to sellouts or traitors to the country.
Strong language. Why?
Because he argued Vox was prioritizing Trump's interests over Spain's. He really hammered the point about the negative impact these unstable tariff policies have.
On who specifically?
On Spanish workers, farmers, small business owners. The uncertainty it creates. Deals get planned, then suddenly tariffs appear, then they're suspended. It disrupts everything. He called it chaotic.
Is there consensus on this within the U.S. Republican Party? Do they all back Trump's tariff approach?
Not entirely, no. There's actually disagreement. Some Republicans are looking for ways to limit his power to impose tariffs unilaterally like this.
Why? Concerned about the economic fallout.
Exactly. Concerns about the potential damage to the economy and also the international friction these moves cause. Even prominent business figures like Elon Musk have spoken out.
What did Musk say?
He publicly criticized Trump's trade advisor quite harshly. So it shows there's unease, even among some who might typically align with conservative policies.
What was the EU's position before all this blew up again?
Well, the EU had actually offered zero mutual tariffs on industrial goods, kind of a baseline offer to negotiate.
And Trump's response?
His administration, particularly Trump himself, kept insisting that countries needed to eliminate their trade surpluses with the U.S., which is, well, a very difficult demand for many countries to meet quickly.
And in the midst of this, the U.S. Treasury Secretary had a warning specifically for Spain.
He did. A stark warning against getting too close to China economically. He compared it to, quote, cutting off your own neck.
Wow. That's blunt. Shows the level of concern in Washington about China's growing influence.
Definitely. And China, predictably, didn't take the U.S. tariffs lying down.
What was their reaction?
A strong one. They imposed their own significant tariffs on U.S. goods, and reportedly halted some exports as well.
So, a trade war escalating.
It certainly raises concerns about serious damage to the global economy.
Yeah.
And it makes people question the stability of the whole U.S.-led global financial system when things like this happen.
Have analysts looked at who gets hurt most by these policies within the U.S.?
Yes. Some analysis suggests Trump's own policies could disproportionately harm states that tend to vote Republican agricultural states, for example.
And the EU might retaliate strategically.
It's been suggested the EU could target its retaliatory tariffs specifically at goods produced in those Republican-leaning states to maximize political pressure. It becomes a very tactical game.
Now, changing perspective slightly, how does someone like Ioni Ballara from Podemos view all this?
From a more ideological standpoint, Ballara sees this kind of international militarism and the law of the strongest playing out in trade as inherent features of capitalism itself.
And she's been critical of Spain's own military spending.
Very critical of the increased military budget. She stated quite clearly that Podemos couldn't be part of a government that promotes what she called a regime of war.
What about Sanchez's diplomatic trips, like the one to Asia? How does she see those?
She views them skeptically, calls them makeup trips, essentially cosmetic.
Meaning?
Meaning she believes they lack any real intention to challenge Spain's economic or military dependence on the United States. It's a critique of Spain's foreign policy alignment.
It's fascinating, isn't it? When you lay it all out like this, you've got Ayuso's partners, legal issues, her trip, Trump's trade moves.
And they all seem to connect through political maneuvering, economic interests. These international power dynamics, they aren't really separate stories.
So for everyone listening, what's the key takeaway here? Hopefully this deep dive has given you a clearer picture, right? Without the usual overload.
Yeah, the idea is you can now grasp the main points, understand the complexities underneath these headlines.
And maybe it leaves us with a thought to chew on. Something we didn't explicitly cover, but builds on all this.
Definitely. How do these domestic political scandals, like the situation with Ayuso's partner, how do they actually intersect with huge global trade shifts and foreign policy decisions?
Right. What does that intersection reveal about the current international landscape? You have a leader dealing with issues at home, potentially impacting their actions abroad, or vice versa.
Exactly. And how do trade tensions, driven by figures like Trump, ripple back into the domestic politics of countries like Spain? It's this complex web.
It shows how interconnected everything is. Personal legal troubles, national politics, global economics. It's not happening in isolation.
A world grappling with shifting alliances, economic uncertainty, and that constant pull between national interests and, well, global cooperation. Understanding these links is pretty crucial right now.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive. We hope it's been informative, shed some light on these complex events.
Remember, staying informed doesn't have to be overwhelming. If you focus on the core issues and how they connect, you can really get a handle on things.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
We'll catch you next time.